I'm Dougal McIntosh, and this is my wife Di, and we welcome you to our property Ratamarumaru farm, which is approximately 20 miles northwest of Wanganui. We're standing on the hill that gives the farm the name, and our altitude here is about 450 meters high. As you can see behind me, we look straight to the south, and this becomes very exposed country in the winter, and particularly when we have any of these weather bombs that we've been experiencing over the last 10 years. One of the reasons for our enthusiasm for forestry is that when we first came to the farm 40 years ago, much of it was covered in gorse and scrub, and we had a huge problem of clearing the scrub, and when we burnt it, of course, it all came up in gorse. And we've had this horrendous weed bill for many years trying to control the gorse. So the only alternative for walking off it was to put it into pine trees. At that stage we were very fortunate, and we got our first forest encouragement grant in the early 70s, and that enabled us to plant our first block. And since then we'd planted about 120 hectares of forestry during the 70s. The financial crises hit us again in the mid-80s, and we were virtually broke. And the only asset that we had, other than sell the whole farm, which wouldn't have covered our debts at the time, the only asset that we had was the forest, this 120 hectares. And so we were very fortunate in being able to form a forest partnership. And this gave us the cash to entice a bank to take us on, get us out of the hole that we'd fallen into. The block of trees over here was the block that we had originally planted in the early 70s, and that was the forest that attracted the outside investors who gave us the independence from the banks. It enabled us to have another life with a different bank, and anyone who was farming in the mid-80s will understand what I'm talking about. We were able to harvest this block in 2000, and that was a planned harvest. We put the roads in, and everything was planned and ordered. And this block netted us approximately $36,000 a hectare, which I think is quite good for hill country. Our harvesting costs are very high because it's all hauler country through here. And what you're looking at now is a 10-year-old second rotation forest. The partners that were in this original McIntosh Forest Partnership were very keen to plant more trees, and so in 2000 we identified another area of the farm, and we planted a further 200 hectares there. With most of the same partnership came through, and the fascinating thing to me, or the very pleasing thing to me and Di, was that some of the children of the original partners are now partners in these new partnerships. The fascinating thing about taking this 200 hectares out of the farm production of a total of 1,100 hectares was that because we didn't have to look after the weed problem and fertilizer and all that sort of thing that goes on this hard marginal country, the production from our farm actually rose. Our ewe numbers increased, and our lambing percentage went from a miserable 95, 98 up to 120 or better. And this just shows how you can be hijacked into spending far too much money on the poorer part of your farm and not concentrating on the better part. Most of the North Island, or the lower North Island, was devastated by the weather bomb of 2004. Of much more significance to us here at Ratamarumaru was the storm of 2006, when there was a very local rainstorm that caused huge erosion on our farm. And some of the paddocks, we lost up to 30% of our grass. This scared the daylights out of Di and me, and so we frantically approached Horizons to see what we ought to be doing with our land, because I thought if we have another storm like this and lose another proportion of our pastoral farm, we could be in real trouble. It was very striking that the land that was already in plantation forestry coped with the adverse events much better than the untreed part of the farm. We had very few slips in the forested area. I think once the trees get to 6 or 8 years old, they're capable of holding the hillside up. Horizon's response was very rapid, and they suggested that we undertake a whole farm plan and identify the strengths and weaknesses of the whole farm, the pastoral land and the land that was suitable for forestry. And as I expected, they identified a further 200 hectares of land that was highly erodible, and it was obvious with all the erosion that we had already experienced. This land desperately needed to be taken out of pastoral farming and put into trees. 2006 was probably not the best time economically to be floating yet another farm forest partnership. But fortunately for us and our farm, Horizon said that they were willing to be a forest partner with us. So we now have approximately 600 hectares of our 1,100 hectares in forestry and about 400 hectares in pastoral farming. The farm itself, the livestock operation, is on the best of our land. We've been able to fertilise it heavily, subdivide, bring water onto the land, etc., and really optimise our ability to farm this area. Our forestry now is, as I've described, a large part of our enterprise. It's almost a second enterprise on its own. The forestry has also given Di and me confidence to plan more long-term, and particularly with succession. When our children were teenagers in the mid-80s and asking us what sort of careers they should follow, I was so bitter at the situation of farming that I advised them to not have anything to do with farming. And in hindsight, I regret this sage advice, because now our 3 children's occupations have nothing to do with farming, and Di and I having to decide what to do, how we can establish the succession for the farm. The exciting thing that forestry has given us is that we now have virtually 2 businesses off the land, the farming side and the forestry side, and both of these could be standalone businesses under their own right. One of the pleasures we've had over the years is being as members of Farm Forestry, and at the risk of talking to the converted, I can't stress how much we've gained from the knowledge of other foresters, both what to do and what not to do. If I had the benefit of being able to start again, I wouldn't do exactly what I've done for the last 40 years. I realise now that the best land use for the marginal country is to have it in trees. And instead of plugging away trying to have a clean green pasture sward over the whole farm, I would immediately put as much into trees as I could. And this doesn't have to be done in the first year. I think the advantage of a spread of age groups is very important, so that it lessens your risk from any storm damage, but it also gives you an even cash flow. If you're able to harvest a block every 3 or 4 years on a 30-year rotation, that would be the ideal. And we are rapidly getting to that stage on our farm now. I think the other point is that it's no good just planting a small pocket of trees at the back of your farm. When you plant your trees, you must be planning on how you're likely to get them out. So you need a minimum of probably 10 hectares in a block, and that's if you're on this steep hill country, and that's enough to attract a harvester. It's enough to justify the roading into it, and all those other costs of access, etc. Once you've got your first 10 hectares, if you've got the luxury of having a bit more land, if you can plant another block in another 2 or 3 years' time, and so on, then your forestry enterprise will grow. I think there are many exciting new forestry species that are coming in. You don't have to be just in Pinus radiata. The other thing that I think is very important is the quality of your forest. And on a farm, you must be aiming for the best value that you can get from your forest. So I believe very firmly that it's essential to have a pruned stand. You're trying to get the highest value from your timber that you can. Although the present enthusiasm is for non-pruned stands and for sawlog, there are figures to show that sawlog is as valuable as a pruned stand. I still believe very strongly that on a small woodlot you ought to be aiming for the highest value you can get. And nobody can say adamantly that today pruned or sawlog will give the best return in 30 years' time. But if you keep all your options open by having a pruned stand, then you can go for the best market at the time. I've found it fascinating over the last few years that the water quality in the streams is improved enormously. The two large streams that run through the farm when I first came here were always muddy. Now, after even quite a large rainstorm, they'll run clear within 24 hours, and I'm sure that's because the forest filters all the sediments. The forestry aspect of our farm is now very important to us, and it's given us the confidence of knowing that we are now running a viable unit that has got a long-term future, which will enable the farm to be kept in the family ownership without anybody actually having to live on it. We are now much more confident of our viability, and also we have the satisfaction of knowing that we're farming in a much more environmentally friendly way than we ever were before, when we were using massive amounts of chemical and I want to say buggering up the country.